She didn't know she'd been sold until the papers were already signed. 28 years old, standing in the kitchen of the only home she'd ever known, Elena Ashcroft watched her foster father slide a folded document across a stranger's weathered hand. And somewhere deep in her chest, something that had always felt fragile finally shattered. No warning, no apology, just a number on a page and a man she'd never met nodding like the whole thing made perfect sense. If this story breaks your heart the way it broke hers, hit like, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far Elena's story can travel. The morning it happened was the kind of morning that made people in Harlow County forget how hard winter could be. October sunshine cut sharp and gold across the frost-pale fields, and the air smelled like pine needles and wood smoke, and the particular dry cold that settles over Montana when the mountains decide summer is finished. Elena Ashcroft had been up since 5, the way she always was, because the Vickers household ran on a schedule that nobody had ever written down, but everyone was expected to follow. Breakfast by 6, dishes by 6:30. Whatever Gerald Vickers decided needed doing after that. She was pulling biscuits from the oven when she heard the truck. It wasn't an unusual sound. Ranchers and neighbors came and went from the Vickers property often enough, but something about this particular engine made Elena set the pan down slowly. Too deliberate. Too even. Most people who came out to rural Harlow County drove like the roads weren't trying to kill them. Whoever was behind that wheel drove like he had nowhere to be but exactly where he was going. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved toward the window above the sink. The truck was black and old, but immaculately kept. The kind of vehicle that had seen 20 hard winters and survived every single one of them. The man who stepped out of it was tall, not in an exaggerated way, but in the way that made other men adjust their posture when he walked into a room. He wore a canvas work coat and a hat that had been bent and shaped by years of actual use, not bought that way at a store. His face, when he turned toward the house, was difficult to read. Not cold exactly, but settled. Like a man who had already decided the most important things a long time ago. Elena didn't know his name. She turned back to the biscuits. Gerald Vickers appeared in the kitchen doorway 3 minutes later, already in his good boots, which meant company he wanted to impress. He was a man built for taking up space, wide shoulders going soft with age, a smile that never quite reached his eyes, and the particular confidence of someone who had never once in his life been told no by anyone who mattered. Elena. He said her name the way he always did, like a period at the end of a sentence. Living room, now. She followed him because she'd learned a long time ago that questioning Gerald's tone before she understood the situation rarely ended in her favor. The stranger was already inside, standing near the fireplace but not close to it, his hat in his hands. He didn't look around the room the way visitors usually did. He looked at the floor, briefly, then at Gerald, and then, just for a moment, at Elena. His eyes were dark brown and completely unreadable, and he looked away from her almost immediately, as if he'd been careful not to stare. Patrice Vickers, Elena's foster mother, was perched on the edge of the armchair by the window with her hands folded and her expression carefully arranged into something that was supposed to look regretful, but mostly just looked rehearsed. "Sit down, sweetheart," Patrice said. Elena didn't sit. "What's happening?" Gerald made the small sound in his throat that meant he found her exhausting. "We're in a bind," he said. "Financial situation. The ranch has been struggling. You know that. We've had to make some hard decisions." "What kind of decisions?" The stranger shifted his weight, just slightly. Elena caught it. "Mr. Mercer here has agreed to take on our debt," Gerald said. "The whole of it. $42,000. Agreed to it in full." The number landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. Elena looked at the man, Mercer, who was still not looking at her. "And what does that have to do with me?" Patrice unfolded her hands and refolded them. "The terms of the agreement. What does that have to do with me?" Elena repeated, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. Gerald's jaw tightened. "You've been living under this roof for 16 years. Clothes, food, schooling. That's not nothing, Elena. You owe this family." "I've worked this house every day for 16 years. That's not the same thing, isn't it?" The room went very quiet. Patrice looked at the window. Gerald looked at Elena with the flat, tired expression he always wore when she failed to simply accept something. And the man named Mercer looked at the floor, and Elena noticed, with a strange detachment, that his hands on the brim of his hat were very still. The arrangement, Gerald said, pulling a folded document from the inside pocket of his jacket, is that you go with Mr. Mercer, work his ranch, help with whatever needs helping. A fair arrangement, given everything. Elena stared at the paper. You're selling me. Nobody's selling anybody. You're trading me to clear a debt. We're making a practical arrangement. That involves me going to live with a man I don't know on a ranch I've never seen to pay off money I didn't borrow. She looked at Mercer directly for the first time. Did you agree to this? All of it? The way he's describing it? Mercer finally looked up. His expression up close was harder to categorize than she'd expected. Not cruel, not triumphant. There was something careful in it, something almost, she couldn't name it precisely, almost pained. You'll have your own room, he said. His voice was low and even. Your own space. No one will bother you. That's not what I asked? He held her gaze. I know. She waited, but he didn't say anything else. The document was signed 40 minutes later. Elena stood in her room afterward and looked at her belongings. 3 years' worth of books stacked against the wall, a quilt she'd made herself from scraps she'd collected over a decade, a coffee mug with a chipped handle she'd kept because it was hers, specifically, and nobody else had ever used it. She didn't cry. She'd learned early that crying in this house didn't accomplish anything except making her eyes puffy and giving Patrice something to feel satisfied about. She packed one bag. Delia, her foster sister, found her in the middle of rolling up the quilt. Delia was 2 years older, sharper around the edges, and possessed of the particular skill of making almost any sentence sound like a small injury. So you're really going, Delia said from the doorway. Looks like it. You're not even going to fight it? Elena kept rolling the quilt. Fight it with what, Delia? Delia leaned against the doorframe and examined her own nails. I told Mom this was a bad idea, for what it's worth. It's not worth a lot, considering you could have said it before the papers were signed. A pause. Rowan Mercer isn't what people say he is. Elena looked up. What do people say he is? Delia shrugged, but it was the careful kind of shrug that meant she knew exactly what she was doing. Quiet men in big ranches with no family and no explanation for how they got their money. She left the rest of the sentence unfinished, which was a technique she'd perfected years ago. Goodbye, Delia. Delia pushed off the doorframe. Good luck, she said, and her voice had dropped the performance out of it, just for a second. I mean it, actually. Elena didn't answer. What? The drive to Blackstone Ridge took 45 minutes, and neither of them spoke for most of it. Elena sat with her bag in her lap and watched the landscape change from the flat farmland around Harlow to the steeper, rockier terrain that climbed toward the mountains. The road narrowed. The pines thickened. The sky, which had been wide and pale blue all morning, pressed closer as the elevation rose. Mercer drove the way his truck arrived, controlled, unhurried. He kept both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road and gave her nothing to interpret. She tried anyway. His hands were work-scarred in the way of someone who'd been ranching since before it was a choice. There was a small old scar along his left jaw that had healed crooked, like it had happened somewhere too far from a doctor. The coat he wore had a button missing on the left cuff, and he hadn't replaced it. He smelled like coffee and cold air and something she couldn't name. Cedar, maybe, or the particular cleanness of high-altitude wind. How long have you had the ranch? She asked, because sitting in complete silence for 45 minutes was beginning to feel like a contest she hadn't agreed to enter. 11 years? Alone? Had a hand for the first 3. He retired. And you haven't replaced him. Managed fine. Elena looked back out the window. Then why do you need me? Several seconds passed. I don't, he said. Need you to manage the ranch. She turned to look at him, but he didn't take his eyes off the road. Then what? She stopped. Restarted. Mr. Mercer. Rowan. I'd like an honest answer to the question. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to give her one. Then, you'll understand better once you've been there a while. It was not an honest answer. It was also, she noted, not a lie designed to reassure her, which was, faintly, reluctantly, something. Blackstone Ridge was not what she'd built in her mind during the drive. She'd expected austerity. A working ranch maintained by a man who lived alone would be functional and nothing more. Dishes in a drying rack, bare wood floors, the particular spareness of a space that no one had ever tried to make comfortable. She was wrong. The house was large and old and clearly built to last, the kind of craftsmanship that happened when someone cared more about the result than the time it took. The porch had been recently swept. Firewood was stacked with the precision of someone who found satisfaction in straight lines. In the window nearest the door, there was a small clay pot with a late-season plant she didn't immediately recognize. Rosemary, she realized after a moment. Hardy and fragrant and deeply unlikely in a bachelor rancher's windowsill. Mercer opened the front door and stepped back to let her through. The inside of the house was warm, a real fire, not just a gas insert, and clean in the way that suggested it had been cleaned recently, not just maintained at a baseline level. The kitchen had good light. The living room had bookshelves that were actually full. Elena stopped in the hallway. "Your room is at the end," Mercer said from behind her. She walked down the hall and opened the door. The room was simple but prepared. A real bed with a quilt that looked hand-stitched, old, and clearly pulled from somewhere it had been stored, not purchased yesterday. A window facing east, a small desk, a braided rug that had some years on it but hadn't given up. And on the windowsill, Elena stopped moving entirely. A blue ribbon, hand-lettered, slightly faded, the kind given at small county fairs for homemade entries. She hadn't seen one like it in years. She reached out and picked it up, and her fingers remembered it before her brain caught up. She had made one like this at the Harlow County Fair 8 years ago. She'd entered a jar of preserves she'd spent the better part of a summer on. She hadn't won. The ribbon was for participation, not placement. But she'd kept it for 2 years before Delia borrowed it for some craft project, and it had disappeared. This ribbon was not that ribbon. The lettering was different, but it was the same fair, the same year, the same county seal stamped in the corner. She turned around. Mercer was standing in the doorway, and for the first time, his carefully maintained composure had developed a small crack. He was watching her hold the ribbon with an expression she couldn't catalog. "Where did you get this?" she asked. His jaw moved. "Fair," he said. "Few years back." "Which fair?" He didn't answer. She set it down carefully. "Mr. Mercer, Rowan. I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to actually answer it." He waited. "Do you know me?" she asked. "Not know of me. Know me. From somewhere." The fire in the living room popped and settled. Outside, the wind had picked up and was moving through the pines in that low, patient way it did before a real cold front arrived. Rowan Mercer looked at the ribbon on the windowsill and then back at her. "Not the way you're asking," he said. "No." It wasn't no. She could hear the rest of the sentence underneath it, all the things he hadn't said, a structure of omission so deliberate it was practically an answer in itself. But she was in his house, in a room he had prepared for her, holding a blue ribbon she had no business understanding, and the afternoon was going dark outside the east-facing window. She didn't push. Not yet. "Thank you for the room," she said. He nodded, once. "Dinner's at 7 if you want it." He pulled the door almost all the way closed behind him, leaving a gap. She noticed this, rather than shutting her in. She didn't sleep well the first night. That wasn't unusual. She rarely slept well anywhere. But the unfamiliarity of Blackstone Ridge was a different kind of wakefulness than she was used to. Not anxious exactly, but alert. The house made sounds she didn't know yet. The wind outside had a different pitch than the valley she'd grown up in. The mattress was real, and the room was warm, and both of those things felt obscurely like something she needed to earn permission for before she could relax into them. Around 2 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and went to the kitchen for water. Mercer was already there. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a mug and a notebook, not reading or writing in it, just sitting with his hand resting on the cover and his eyes not quite focused on anything. He startled when she came in, which she hadn't expected. A man as controlled as he seemed shouldn't startle, but he did. Just a small flinch, quickly covered, but she caught it. "Sorry," she said. "Water." "Help yourself." She found a glass and filled it from the tap and stood at the counter and drank half of it. He had put the notebook on the chair beside him, cover down, and he was now very deliberately looking at his coffee mug. "What's in the notebook?" she asked. "Nothing." Then a beat later. "Notes. Ranch business." She finished the water, set the glass down. "You don't sleep much either." "Enough." "That's not the same thing." He looked up at that, briefly, with the closest thing to surprise she'd seen on his face, like he hadn't expected the echo of his own earlier answer to come back at him. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the beginning of something. "No," he agreed. "It's not." She took her water glass back to the bedroom. She didn't sleep much better after that, but she woke up the next morning with the strange, unsettling sense that she understood something slightly different than she had the night before. Not what, not yet, but the shape of it. On the kitchen table, before she got up, she could hear him moving. The particular cadence of someone who'd been alone a long time and had built a careful, functional life out of it, and who was now moving around his own kitchen with a slightly different kind of attention than usual, trying not to make too much noise. She lay in the east-facing room and listened to the careful sounds of a man who didn't know she was awake. And somewhere underneath the confusion and the anger and the exhaustion of the last 24 hours, a single question she hadn't asked yet began to settle in with the quiet persistence of the first snow. Why this room? Why that ribbon? Why her, specifically, out of everyone Gerald Vickers might have traded to clear a debt? The answer was somewhere in that house. She was going to find it. The first week at Blackstone Ridge passed the way unfamiliar things usually do. Slowly at first, then all at once. Elena had expected resistance. Not violence, not cruelty, but the particular friction of two strangers forced into close proximity, the invisible negotiations over space and routine, and whose habits would yield to whose. She'd lived with the Vickers family long enough to understand that households had power structures as real and rigid as anything written on paper, and she had always occupied the bottom of theirs. She'd expected Blackstone Ridge to be the same, only worse, because at least with the Vickers, she'd known the rules. Rowan Mercer didn't seem to have rules. Or if he did, they weren't aimed at her. He woke before dawn every morning and was already outside by the time she came to the kitchen, which meant the coffee was always made and the fire was always built up, and she never once had to navigate the awkwardness of being the first one awake in someone else's house. He didn't assign her tasks or explain expectations or tell her what time meals were supposed to happen. He just moved through his day with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd been operating alone for a long time, and he left room for her to move through hers. It should have been a relief. It wasn't, entirely. Relief requires a certain degree of trust, and trust was something Elena parceled out in very small quantities, only after extended observation. She observed. He drank his coffee black, 2 cups in the morning, and never touched it after noon. He worked outside in almost any weather without complaint, but he came in when the temperature dropped below a certain point without being told to, which meant he had enough sense to know his own limits, a quality she'd found surprisingly rare in men who worked with their hands. He talked to the horses differently than he talked to people, looser, easier, with a kind of patience that didn't seem like performance. He read at night, serious books, the kind with bent spines and margin notes in his own handwriting, though she never got close enough to read what he'd written, and he never asked her to explain herself. Not once. She'd knock something over in the kitchen and he'd just pick it up. She'd go quiet at dinner for no reason she wanted to share, and he'd let the quiet sit there without poking at it. She'd come in from the barn in a mood she couldn't fully account for, and he'd glance at her once, read whatever he read in her expression, and leave her alone. It was, she realized after about 10 days, the most consideration anyone had ever shown her, which made it more suspicious, not less. On the 11th day, she found the books. She hadn't been snooping, not exactly. She'd been looking for a particular title she'd noticed on the shelf in the living room, something she'd wanted to read for years and never had access to, and she'd been running her fingers along the spines trying to locate it, when her hand stopped on a small paperback tucked between 2 larger volumes. She pulled it out without thinking, and it fell open in her hands. It was a collection of frontier poetry, worn soft with handling, the cover image almost completely faded. Inside the front cover, in handwriting she didn't recognize, someone had written a single line, "For the woman who reads in the barn so she doesn't have to ask permission." Elena stood very still. She turned the book over, put it back, took it out again. The handwriting was careful and even, Not Rowan's, or at least not the same hand she'd seen in the margins of his other books. Older, maybe. Different ink. She put it back where she'd found it and went to find her own book. That evening at dinner, she didn't bring it up. She watched him instead, watched the way he ate, and talked about the weather forecast and the fence line on the north pasture that needed attention before the first real snow. And she looked for some evidence that he was hiding something obvious and had simply been clever enough not to show it yet. She didn't find it. What she found instead was more unsettling. A man who seemed, as far as she could tell, to simply be what he appeared to be. Quiet. Careful. Not unkind. She trusted that least of all. "Can I ask you something?" she said when he was carrying plates to the sink. "Sure." "The horses. You've got 6. You run this ranch alone or close enough to it. You don't seem to need the help." She paused. "I keep trying to figure out where I'm supposed to fit here." He set the plates down and turned around, leaning back against the counter with his arms crossed. It was the most casual she'd seen him stand. "What did you do at the vicar's place?" he asked. "Everything they needed?" Everything meaning what? She considered being vague and decided against it. Cooking, cleaning, seasonal work on the property when Gerald needed extra hands, bookkeeping for 2 years when Patrice couldn't manage it anymore, whatever needed doing. "You do all that because you wanted to?" "I did it because I lived there." "Right." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to do any of that here. The cooking, the cleaning. I manage fine." "Then what?" "I'm not going to give you a list of duties, Elena." He said her name like it was a word he'd used before, which was strange because he said it rarely. "The arrangement with Gerald was about the debt, not about you working for me." She stared at him. "Then what was it about?" His jaw did the thing it did when he was deciding how much to say. "Not yet," he said. "You keep saying that." "I know. It's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He picked up a dish towel and started drying the plates, which was clearly a signal that the conversation was over for now. "There's a mare in the 3rd stall that's been favoring her left foreleg. If you know horses, she'd probably appreciate the attention." Elena knew horses. She'd known horses her entire life and had rarely had the time to give them the kind of attention she actually wanted to. She went to the barn after dinner and spent an hour with the mare, who was a dark bay with a white star and the suspicious eyes of an animal that had been hurt by carelessness at some point and hadn't forgotten it. "Yeah," Elena told her, checking the leg carefully. "I know how that is." The mare turned her head and breathed warm air against Elena's shoulder and didn't pull away. She found the first fare ticket 3 days later. It was tucked inside a glass jar on the windowsill in the mudroom. The kind of jar people used for small things they didn't know what to do with, spare change and old keys and the miscellaneous paper debris of daily life. She'd been looking for a rubber band and she'd upended the jar into her palm, and there it was, a carnival ride ticket, orange, dated 8 years back. The stamp on it was from the Harlow County Fair. She put it back in the jar without saying anything. The next discovery was harder to dismiss. She was helping Rowan clear brush from the fence line on the north pasture. She'd started helping with outdoor work. Not because he'd asked her to, but because standing still had never suited her, and 8 years of managed helplessness had left her with an excess of restless energy. When she spotted something half buried under a fallen branch, a small tin, rusted at the edges, the kind used for candy or small keepsakes. It must have been there a long time. The ground had grown up partway around it. She picked it up without opening it and carried it back to where Rowan was working. "This yours?" He looked at it for a moment. Something shifted behind his eyes. "Where'd you find that?" "Fence line, near the big spruce." He took it from her, held it with both hands. "Yeah," he said. "Mine." "What's in it?" "Old stuff." She waited. He put the tin in his coat pocket and went back to work, and she made a decision in that moment that felt important. She was going to stop waiting for him to explain himself and start looking for the answers on her own terms. That night, she sat at the small desk in her room and tried to think through what she knew. The blue ribbon from the Harlow County Fair 8 years ago. The carnival ticket, same year, same fair. A poetry book with a handwritten inscription about a woman who read in barns. A man who had agreed to take on $42,000 in someone else's debt without negotiating, without hesitation, in exchange for apparently nothing in particular. He had known somehow how she took her coffee. He had somehow known she liked her bookshelves organized by subject rather than alphabetically. She'd noticed on the second day that the books in the living room were arranged that way. He had known, or guessed, that she'd respond better to a horse with trust issues than to a horse that was easy. None of those things were conclusive. Some of them might be coincidence. But taken together, they had a shape that she couldn't quite see the edges of yet. And the not seeing of it was beginning to keep her up at night more than the unfamiliar house sounds ever had. She thought about the notebook she'd seen him sitting with that first night, his hand resting on the cover, the way he'd moved it before she could see it. She wasn't going to snoop through his things. That wasn't the kind of person she was, and it wouldn't have told her anything reliable anyway, but she was going to pay closer attention. Delia showed up on a Thursday. Elena hadn't expected her, which was probably the point. She heard the car before she saw it, a newer model sedan, not Delia's usual truck, and came out onto the porch to find her foster sister climbing out of the passenger side with her sunglasses pushed up on her head and an expression Elena had seen before and never liked. The look Delia wore when she'd decided she was doing someone a favor by showing up. "You look better than I expected," Delia said. "Thanks. Place is nice." Delia looked up at the house with genuine assessment. "Better than nice, actually, huh?" "What are you doing here, Delia?" "Checking on you." She said it simply, like the simplest explanation was always the right one. "Mom and Dad don't know I came." "Okay." Delia sat down on the porch steps, which was the move of someone who planned to stay a while. Elena sat down too, because standing over Delia always felt like a posture she had to maintain. "He treating you all right?" Delia asked. "He's treating me fine." "Fine meaning actually fine, or fine meaning you don't want to talk about it?" Elena looked at the tree line. "Actually fine." Delia picked at a splinter on the step. "People in town talk about him, you know. Rowan Mercer. They don't know much, which is why they talk." "What do they say?" "That he showed up in Harlow County about 12 years ago with enough money to buy the ridge, and nobody knows where he came from before that. That he doesn't come into town much. That he's never had a woman out here." She paused meaningfully. "Until now. I'm not a woman he has. I'm a person Gerald traded for debt forgiveness." "I know what you are. I'm telling you what people say." Elena turned to look at her directly. "Why are you here, Delia? The real reason." Delia was quiet long enough that Elena knew she'd hit something. "Dad's been talking," she finally said, "about the arrangement. I think he's been telling people it was your idea, that you wanted to come here." The anger came fast and hot, and Elena pushed it back down. "Of course he has. I just thought you should know." "Okay. I know." Delia stood up, brushed off the back of her jeans. She looked out toward the barn for a moment, then back at Elena with an expression that was uncharacteristically unguarded. "Just be careful," she said. "That's all. I don't know what Mercer wants, but nobody pays off $42,000 for nothing." Elena said nothing. "Nobody," Delia repeated, softer this time, and went back to the car. Rowan came around the side of the house 10 minutes later and stopped when he saw Elena still sitting on the steps. "Who was that?" "My foster sister." He sat down on the step below hers, which put them at roughly the same eye level, and she noticed he'd done that deliberately. Not looming, not deferring, just leveling. "She come to check on you?" "She came to tell me my foster father is telling people I chose to come here." Rowan's expression didn't change much, but something around his eyes went tight. "Is that right? Does that surprise you?" "No." "Did you know what kind of people they were before you made the arrangement?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes." Something about the simplicity of that answer hit her harder than she expected. She turned to look at him fully. "Then why didn't you just report them? Tell someone what they were doing? You clearly have money and connections enough to—" "Because that would have taken time," he said, "and time wasn't something you had." The pines moved in the wind. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses knocked against a stall door. Elena looked at the mountain and then at her own hands. "You keep saying things like that," she said carefully. "Things that imply you know more about my situation than a stranger should." He didn't answer. "Rowan." "Yeah. Look at me." He did. I'm not going to fall apart if you tell me the truth. I've handled worse than whatever it is you're holding back. I just need to know, are you dangerous to me? He held her gaze without flinching. No. Are you hiding something that's going to hurt me when I find out? Longer pause this time. I don't think so. You don't think so isn't no, he said again, more firmly. No. It's not going to hurt you, but it's something I need to tell you right. Not out here on a porch step because your sister's visit scared us both into it. She didn't scare me. I know. I meant me. That stopped her. She looked at him. Really looked. The way she hadn't let herself do since she arrived, because looking too carefully at people had always been something she did at a cost. And found a man who was, underneath all that controlled quiet, visibly holding something heavy. Not dangerous heavy. Not secret-keeping for bad reasons heavy. The other kind. The kind that had weight because it mattered. She let out a breath. Okay, she said. Okay? Tell me when you're ready. But don't make me wait forever. He nodded once. She got up and went inside, and she didn't look back to see if he stayed on the steps or not, because some moments were better left unobserved. He stayed on the steps for a long time. She could hear him from the kitchen window. November moved in hard that week. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 days, and the sky turned the flat, opaque white that people in mountain country recognize as a serious weather warning. Rowan spent most of 3 days reinforcing the barn and laying an extra feed, and Elena worked alongside him because standing inside watching the sky get worse felt worse than being outside doing something about it. They developed, almost without discussing it, a working rhythm. She handled the horses and the lighter structural work. He handled the heavier lifting and the decisions about the property. Neither of them narrated it or negotiated it. It just settled into place the way useful things do when two people are paying attention to what needs doing. On the second evening of storm preparation, they were both in the barn when the first real snow began. Not the preliminary flurries of the past few days, but the real thing, heavy and windblown, cutting visibility down to 30 feet within minutes. Elena stood in the barn doorway watching it come and felt, for the first time since arriving at Blackstone Ridge, the specific loneliness of being in a place that wasn't hers yet, during weather that didn't care what year it was or what agreements had or hadn't been honored. Hey! Rowan appeared beside her. He was looking at the snow, too. Big one, she said. Bigger than the forecast. Usually are. They stood there for a moment. The barn was warm at their backs, and the storm was white and furious ahead of them, and neither of them moved. That first night, Elena said, when I found you in the kitchen, with the notebook. Yeah. What was in it? He didn't answer right away. But this time, instead of the deliberate closing off she'd learned to recognize, it was something else, more like he was choosing his entry point carefully, the way you do when you're about to say something that matters. Things I remembered, he said. About what? He reached over and pulled the barn door partway closed against the wind. The snow sound muffled. The horses shifted and settled behind them. About you, he said. The word landed in the warm, straw-scented air between them and stayed there. Elena kept her eyes on the wall of white beyond the door. We've never met, she said. Before this. No. Then how? There's a right way to explain it, he said. This isn't it. She turned to look at him, standing there in the barn doorway with snow in his hair and his hands in his coat pockets and his expression doing the thing it always did, holding more than it showed. And she wanted to push. She had every right to push. But something stopped her, some instinct she'd developed over years of reading situations and people and the precise weight of the wrong moment. How long? She asked instead. 8 years, he said. Give or take. Elena held that number in her head. 8 years. She'd been 20 when she entered the Harlow County Fair with a jar of preserves she'd spent a summer making, alone, in a kitchen that wasn't hers, for a family that wouldn't have noticed if she hadn't. Okay, she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. Okay? I'm not okay. I just don't know what else to say right now. He nodded, didn't push. They closed the barn up together and walked back to the house through the beginning of the storm, and neither of them said anything else that night, and Delia's parting question from the week before settled back into Elena's thoughts with new and unsettling weight. Why did Rowan choose you? She still didn't have the answer. But for the first time, standing in the kitchen of a house that still didn't feel like hers, listening to snow build against the windows, she believed that the answer existed, that it was real, that it was somewhere in a worn notebook with water-stained covers that a man she barely knew had been keeping for 8 years. And she was beginning to understand that when it came, it was going to rearrange everything she thought she knew about the distance between strangers. The blizzard hit Harlow County on a Wednesday, which nobody was ready for because the forecast had said Thursday. Elena woke at 4 in the morning to the sound of the wind doing something she hadn't heard it do before. Not the patient, low movement through the pines she'd grown accustomed to over the past weeks, but something angrier and more purposeful, a sustained pressure against the house that made the old timbers creak and talk in the dark. She lay still for a moment, listening. The temperature in her room had dropped despite the fire Rowan kept banked through the night. She could see her own breath. She dressed in the dark and came out to the kitchen to find him already in his coat and boots, standing at the window with a coffee mug he hadn't touched, watching the snow come down in a way that told her this was worse than either of them had prepared for. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad." He set the mug down. "Wind shifted overnight, coming off the mountain now instead of across the valley. That changes things." "The barn?" "Reinforced. But I've got horses in the south paddock I moved out yesterday for rotation. I need to get them in." Elena was already reaching for her coat. "I'll come." "You don't have to." "Rowan." She looked at him. "I'll come." He didn't argue. What she'd learned by now was his version of gratitude. They went out into it together, and the cold was a different category of experience than anything Elena had dealt with before. The kind that doesn't just sit on your skin, but pushes through it, looking for something to ruin. The snow was coming sideways, real sideways, not the poetic kind, and visibility was down to maybe 20 feet in the beam of Rowan's lantern. She kept close to him across the yard because losing sight of the house in conditions like this was a real possibility, not a dramatized one. The south paddock was 200 yards from the main barn, which felt like a very long way. They moved in single file, Rowan ahead with the lantern, and Elena kept one hand on the fence line where she could find it. The horses in the paddock were already panicked. She could hear them before she could see them, that particular distress sound that horses make when they've lost confidence in the situation and are about 30 seconds from making a bad decision about it. "I'll take the gate," she called over the wind. "You get in with them. Keep them from bolting." He turned to look at her. The lantern light caught his face from below, and she couldn't read his expression. "Gate latch is iced," he said. "I can manage a gate." He went. She fought the latch for 45 seconds with numb fingers before it gave, and then the next problem became immediately clear. The horses didn't want to come through. They were bunched in the far corner of the paddock, all 4 of them, and the combination of the storm and the open gate in the dark was doing nothing to convince them that through was better than where they were. "Easy," Elena said, and then felt slightly absurd saying it because the wind was so loud. It was unlikely any horse was hearing her register as distinct from the rest of the chaos. But she said it again anyway. "Easy. Come on." Rowan moved behind them, slow and deliberate, the way she'd watched him work with nervous horses in the barn. No rushing, no loud sounds, just a persistent, patient presence that left them room to choose. The mare Elena had been working with, the dark bay with the white star, and the trust issues broke first. Once she moved, the others followed in the messy, crowded way that horses follow each other when they're scared, and Elena stood to the side of the gate and counted them through and latched it behind the last one. Getting 4 panicked horses across 200 yards of blizzard in the dark was not something anyone would describe as going well. It went, which was the best available description. They skittered and pulled, and once the youngest one, a 3-year-old gray that Rowan called February, stopped completely and refused to move for nearly a full minute while the wind tried to take everyone's hat. But they got them into the main barn, and Elena bolted the barn doors behind her and stood in the relative warmth of the interior and waited for her hands to stop shaking. Rowan was checking each horse in turn, running his hands down legs and flanks, looking for injuries from the scramble across the yard. He was methodical about it, and she watched him work, and something she'd been trying not to feel for several weeks now settled uncomfortably into a shape she couldn't avoid naming. She trusted him, not completely. She wasn't built for complete trust, and she suspected she never would be. But enough. More than she'd trusted anyone in a long time. It was inconvenient. "February's okay?" she asked. "Fine. Scared, but fine." He moved to the next stall. "You all right?" "My hands are numb." "Gloves are in the tack room. Should have said. Should have brought my own." He glanced at her. "You brought a quilt and 3 books." "4 books." The corner of his mouth moved. She turned away before she had to deal with what her own face was doing. They stayed in the barn for 2 hours while the storm ramped up to something genuinely alarming outside. Rowan had a small propane heater for exactly this kind of situation, and they sat on upturned feed buckets near the center aisle with their hands wrapped around coffee from a thermos he'd had the presence of mind to bring and listen to the wind assault the roof. The horses had calmed. That particular quality of barn quiet, animals breathing, straw shifting, the occasional soft knock of a hoof, settled around them, and Elena felt her shoulders come down from somewhere around her ears. "Tell me something," she said. "What?" "Something about yourself, not about the ranch, not about the weather." She looked at the middle distance. "Something I wouldn't guess." He was quiet for a moment. "I used to play piano," he said. She turned to look at him. He was staring at his coffee. "Seriously?" "Through high school, was decent at it." He shrugged one shoulder. "Stopped when I came out here, don't have one." "Why'd you stop?" "Didn't fit the life I was building." "Do you miss it?" Another pause. "Sometimes I hear music and my hands do the thing, start moving without me deciding they should." He looked at his right hand like he was remembering something specific. "Yeah, sometimes." Elena sat with that for a moment. It was such a human, sideways kind of grief. Not dramatic, not a story he'd ever told anyone for effect. Just something that had fit once and didn't anymore, and he'd put it down the way you put down a thing you can't carry on the terrain you've chosen. "I used to draw," she said, and was mildly surprised to hear herself say it. "When I was a kid, before the Vickers." "What kind of drawing?" "Animals, mostly. I was good at horses." She almost laughed at that. "I stopped because Patrice said it was a waste of time. Paper was expensive. I was supposed to be helping." Rowan said nothing, but she could feel the weight of his listening. "I never started again," she said. "I kept thinking I would, keep thinking I will." "You should." "Yeah." "Not a suggestion. You're good with them, the horses. That kind of attention it transfers." She looked at him. "You don't know what my drawings looked like." "No," he agreed. "But I know how you work." The storm gusted hard enough that the barn doors shook in their frame, and both of them looked up instinctively, the way people do when a structure they're inside makes a sound it shouldn't. "It's holding," Rowan said. "Meaning the barn, meaning the doors, meaning more than that too, maybe." It was around this point that a new sound filtered through. Not the wind, not the structure, but something else. High-pitched, intermittent, coming from the direction of the northern fence line. It took Elena a few seconds to place it, and then she was on her feet. "That's horses," she said. "Not ours." Rowan was already moving. He grabbed the lantern and went to the small side door, cracked it against the wind, and listened. It came again, distressed, multiple animals, far enough away to be the neighboring property, but close enough to hear. "The Caldwell place," he said. His face had gone tight. "Their north pasture backs up to our fence. If their horses got spooked and ran—" He stopped. She could see him running the calculation. The ravine. Elena knew about the ravine. She'd seen it from a distance. A long, steep drop along the back of the Caldwell property that the fence was supposed to keep livestock away from. In a blizzard, in the dark, with panicked horses, the fence was not a reliable guarantee. "How many do they have?" she asked. 6, last I counted. Caldwell's in town, his daughter's appendix. He left yesterday morning. "So there's nobody over there?" Rowan pulled his coat tighter. "I'm going." "I'm coming." "Elena, I'm coming, Rowan." She said it flatly, not a negotiation. He looked at her for 1 second, then handed her the better lantern. They went back out into the storm. Getting to the Caldwell fence line required crossing Blackstone Ridge's north pasture, which was familiar enough to navigate even in low visibility, but the snow had drifted in the hours since they'd last been out, and what had been clear ground was now thigh-high in places. They moved slower than either of them wanted to. Elena kept the lantern high and focused on Rowan's back and put her feet where he put his. They heard the horses before they found the fence, and what they heard was bad. Not the controlled panic of animals wanting shelter, the kind of chaos that meant animals running without direction, in the dark, toward something rather than away from it. The Caldwell fence had come down on the eastern corner. Not broken, just pulled free from 3 posts by what was probably a spooked horse hitting it at speed. Through the gap they could make out movement in the lantern light, horses circling, running, doubling back. "I count 4, Elena said. 2 must have gotten past already." Rowan's voice was grim. "Toward the ravine." "Go," she said. "I'll hold these 4. Get them to the fence gap. I'll redirect." "You can't hold 4 horses alone." "I don't need to hold them. I need to turn them. Go." He went. She positioned herself between the circling horses and the open eastern direction, arms wide, lantern swinging, making herself as large and loud as the storm would let her. It was exhausting, and it was terrifying, and twice a horse came so close she felt the wind of its body moving past her, but she held her ground and kept turning them back, working them in a wide arc toward the fence gap where she could funnel them through to Blackstone's pasture. She got 2 of them through before she heard Rowan shout. It was the kind of shout that cuts through other sound, not words, just a sudden sharp break in the steady ambient noise of the storm, and then silence where his voice had been. Elena turned. The lantern's beam didn't reach far enough. She moved toward where she'd last seen him moving, and the ground changed under her feet, sloping, icy, the particular steep and wrong feeling of terrain that meant she was closer to the ravine than she should be. She stopped moving her feet and held the lantern up. Rowan was at the edge, not over it. At it. He'd slid. She could see the track in the snow where his boots had lost purchase on the ice slope, and caught himself on a half-buried fence post that was not going to hold him for long. Below him was 30 feet of dark and hard ground. "Hold on," she said, and her voice came out very steady, which surprised her, because the rest of her was not. She moved toward him carefully, flat-footed, testing each step. The slope was bad, not impossible, but the kind of thing where one wrong distribution of weight would send her the same direction he'd gone. She looped the lantern over her wrist so she had both hands free and kept moving. "The post," he said. His voice was even, too even, the way voices get when someone is spending most of their focus on something physical. "It's coming loose." "I see it." "Elena, if the ground goes, stop talking and hold on." She reached him, got one hand around his forearm and planted her feet wide and leaned back against the slope with everything she had, which was not as much as she would have liked. He was a large man and the angle was bad, and the snow was not cooperating. "I need you to find a foothold," she said. "There's a rock about 18 inches to your left. I can see it." "I can't." "Rowan, the rock, left foot." He found it. The moment he had 2 points of contact instead of 1, the dynamic changed enough that she could pull and he could push, and they moved up the slope in an ugly, incremental way. Not graceful, not controlled, more like 2 people refusing to lose to a hillside until the grade leveled out and the fence post stopped being the only thing between him and the bottom of the ravine. They sat in the snow at the top of the slope for approximately 10 seconds, both breathing hard. "The other horses," Elena said. "One got past the ravine edge. Other one turned." He was already getting up. "I heard it go." "I'm sorry." "Yeah," he said it quietly. "Yeah." They gathered the remaining Caldwell horses, 3, in the end, and found the 4th one on the Blackstone side of the fence where it had followed the others through the gap Elena had held open, and got them into the barn alongside their own. It was past 7 in the morning by the time they got back inside the house, and the storm showed no sign of slowing. Elena's hands were beyond numb. She sat at the kitchen table and tried to get her boots off, and couldn't manage the laces, and Rowan, who had come in behind her, crouched down without saying anything and undid them himself. She looked at the top of his head. Snow still in his hair. A cut on the back of his right hand from the fence post, not deep, but bleeding slowly. "Your hand," she said. "It's fine. It's bleeding. I know where the kit is." She didn't argue. He got up and found the first aid kit from the cabinet above the sink and sat across the table from her and dealt with the cut himself, not asking for help, not making a production of it. She watched him work and felt the accumulated weight of the last several hours pressing down on her chest. "You could have gone over," she said. "But I didn't." "That's not—" She stopped, started again. If you had gone over, I would have been alone out here in that storm, with your horses and your ranch and no idea. She stopped again because her voice was doing something she didn't want it to do. He looked up from the bandage. Scared, but that's not the point. She pressed her hands flat on the table. I went out there tonight because I didn't want you to get hurt, which was... She laughed slightly, not a happy sound, which was not a thing I expected to feel 3 weeks ago. Rowan set the bandage down. He sat with her words for a moment, not rushing to fill the space. I need to tell you something, he said. Okay, tonight's probably not the right time either, but I'm running out of ways to justify waiting. Elena nodded. She was exhausted and cold, and her hands were still shaking slightly, and the kitchen smelled like coffee and wet wool and wood smoke, and she thought distantly that she was going to remember the specific quality of this moment for a very long time. Rowan got up and went to the shelf beside the door and came back with the notebook, the worn one, water-stained cover, that she'd seen him with that first night. He set it on the table between them. I didn't bring you here to work, he said. I didn't bring you here because of Gerald's debt. I mean, those things are real, but they're not why. Okay. 8 years ago, Harlow County Fair. He looked at the notebook, not at her. I was there. I was passing through, actually. I didn't know the county, didn't know anyone. I was looking at buying land in the area. It was a Saturday, and the fair was on, and I stopped because it seemed like the kind of place where you could read a town. Elena said nothing. There was a girl, little one, maybe 6 or 7. She'd lost her family in the crowd, and she was standing by the pie booth trying not to cry. People walked past her. A lot of people. He paused. And then this woman, young, maybe 20, she stopped. She had a jar she'd been carrying around all day, preserves she'd entered in the competition. She crouched down and talked to the little girl for a while, and then she gave her every dollar she had in her pocket for a ride ticket so the girl could go on the carousel and stay in one place until her people found her. And then she stayed there with her for 40 minutes, until the family came back. The kitchen was very quiet. She missed the competition results, Rowan said. Her entry won a participation ribbon. By the time the family came back and the girl was okay, the woman went back to the booth and the judging was over, and she just took the ribbon and put it in her pocket and walked away. Like it didn't matter. Like the 40 minutes was the point, not the prize. Elena was looking at her own hands on the table. I didn't know your name, he said. I didn't talk to you that day. I was a stranger, and you were busy, and it was just a thing I saw. But I didn't forget it. And after I bought the ridge and settled here, I started to notice you, not in a watching way, just Harlow County is small, and certain people, when you pay attention, you see them. What they do when nobody's offering them anything for it. He opened the notebook to the first page and turned it toward her. It was a dated entry, 8 years ago, October. A paragraph in his careful, even handwriting. She read the first line. Woman at the pie booth, maybe 20, blue coat. Gave her last $5 to a lost kid and waited with her like it was the only thing happening in the world. She turned the pages slowly. There were more entries. Not frequent, sometimes months apart, but consistent. A notation about a woman who'd helped a neighbor with a roof after a storm, quietly, and left before anyone organized thanks. A note about someone who'd found a wallet on the road outside Harlow and spent an afternoon tracking down the owner instead of keeping the cash inside it. Someone who dropped firewood on an old man's porch every November without knocking. He hadn't known her name for most of it. Several entries just said the woman from the fair. Her name appeared for the first time 4 years in, written in the same steady hand, like he'd finally confirmed something he'd long suspected. Elena Ashcroft. That's her name. She closed the notebook, set her hands on top of it. Her eyes were burning, and she was furious about that. You watched me for 8 years, she said. Not watched, noticed. I know there's a difference. Her voice came out rough. I'm not saying it wrong. I know what you mean. She looked at him. Why didn't you just talk to me? At some point in 8 years? Because you were in a situation that wasn't mine to walk into, he said. And because every time I thought about it, it sounded like exactly what it sounds like right now. Crazy. It does sound crazy. Yeah. And also not, she said, which is the part that's messing me up. He sat back. He looked tired in a way she recognized, Not body tired, but the tired of carrying something heavy for a long time in a direction you weren't sure was right. When Gerald came to me, Rowan said, when I heard what he was planning, what he intended to do with you, the people he was talking to, his jaw tightened. I'm not going to tell you the details tonight, but it was worse than what happened. What I did was the fastest way to stop it. Elena absorbed that slowly. You weren't supposed to feel like a transaction, he said. I know it did. I know I couldn't explain it the right way on the day. I'm sorry for that. The fire in the other room cracked and shifted. Outside, the storm was still going, still pushing against the windows with that steady, indifferent force. The room, Elena said. You had it ready for me. Yes. The coffee, my books, the mare. Yes. The ribbon. That one. He stopped. I found it at the fair, same year. You dropped it on the way out, I think. I kept it because... He didn't finish. Because why? He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Blackstone Ridge, his expression wasn't controlled. It was just a man's face, tired and honest and not entirely sure what came next. Because I thought if I ever figured out how to explain any of this, he said, I'd give it back. Elena looked at the notebook under her hands, at the cut on his bandaged hand, at the man sitting across from her who had watched her be quietly, unspectacularly decent for 8 years, and decided, for reasons she still couldn't fully map, that it mattered. She didn't have an answer for any of it. Not yet. Maybe not for a while. The feeling in her chest was too complicated to name cleanly. Not gratitude? Not quite. Not anger anymore, though the shape of it was still there underneath. Something that had more to do with the terrifying, inconvenient realization that she was seen, specifically, by someone who had chosen to see her without asking for anything in return. She pushed back from the table and stood. I'm going to sleep, she said. We can talk more when the storm's over. He nodded. Yeah, okay. She picked up the notebook and held it for a second. Then she set it back in front of him. Keep it, she said, for now. She went down the hall to the east-facing room and lay down on the bed, with her coat still on because she was too tired to deal with it, and she stared at the ceiling and listened to the blizzard trying to undo everything outside. And she thought about a little girl on a carousel, and a $5 bill, and a woman who had stayed because staying was the right thing, not because anyone would know. She thought about the fact that someone had known. She didn't sleep for a long time. The storm blew itself out by Friday morning, leaving behind 2 feet of snow and the particular silence that follows extreme weather. Not peaceful exactly, but exhausted. Like the valley itself needed a day to recover. Elena spent the first calm morning shoveling the path from the house to the barn, which was not something Rowan had asked her to do and not something she'd announced she was going to do. She just did it, the way she'd always managed hard feelings, by finding something physical and useful and putting her body into it until her head caught up. She had a lot to think about. The conversation from the night of the storm had settled into her in the way that significant things do. Not all at once, but in layers, each one revealing something she'd missed in the one before. She kept returning to the notebook, to the entry from 8 years ago, to the way he'd written like it was the only thing happening in the world, which was not how she had experienced that afternoon at the fair at all. She'd been cold and a little frustrated, and the little girl had been crying in that specific way that made it impossible to walk away. And she'd done what anyone would have done if they'd stopped long enough to notice. Except apparently they hadn't stopped or noticed. She thought about that a lot. Rowan left her to the shoveling, which she appreciated. He had his own work, checking the structural aftermath of the storm, confirming the fence line, calling Caldwell about the horses they'd taken in. She could hear him on the phone through the kitchen window, his voice low and even, explaining what had happened in the straightforward way he explained most things, without dramatizing it and without leaving anything out. She heard him mention the ravine, heard the silence that followed on his end while Caldwell presumably processed what that meant. Then Rowan said something she couldn't make out, and the conversation moved on. They didn't talk about the notebook again that day, or the next. Not because it was being avoided. It wasn't, or at least it didn't feel that way to Elena. It was more that the conversation had opened something that needed air before it could go further, and both of them seemed to understand that without discussing it. What changed between them was quieter than she expected, more practical. He started explaining his decisions about the ranch rather than just making them, which was a small thing but not a small thing. She started asking questions that weren't tests, which was the biggest change of all. They ate dinner together and talked about Caldwell and the fence and the coming winter season, and it felt for the first time like a conversation between two people who had agreed to be in the same place rather than two people who'd had it decided for them. It was 12 days after the storm when the car came back. Not Delia's borrowed sedan this time. A newer car, darker, with a Billings plate and the look of something rented. Elena was in the barn when she heard it, and some instinct, old and well-trained, made her stay where she was for a moment before going out. She heard Delia's voice first, then a man's voice she didn't know, then Gerald Vickers and the sound of his boots on the porch stairs, and something in Elena's chest tightened into a shape she recognized from years of living in that house. The specific bracing that happened when Gerald walked into a room with an agenda. She put down the brush she'd been using on the bay mare and went outside. There were 4 of them on the porch, Gerald and Patrice in her good coat, the one she wore when she needed to look like a certain kind of woman. Delia, standing slightly apart from the others with her arms crossed and an expression Elena couldn't read from this distance. And a man she didn't know, 50s. City dressed in a way that looked wrong against the Montana snow, carrying a briefcase and the particular confidence of someone who'd been paid to be difficult. Rowan had come around from the side of the house. He was standing at the base of the porch steps, not going up, not going back. Elena walked across the yard. Gerald saw her coming and arranged his face into the version of itself that was supposed to look paternal. She'd hated that face for 20 years. Elena, he spread his hands. We've been worried about you. No, you haven't. The man with the briefcase glanced at her and then at Rowan. Perhaps we should take this inside. Mr. Mercer, I'm Warren Holt, representing the Vickers family in this matter. I have some documentation I think you'll want to— What matter? Elena said. Holt blinked at her, slightly thrown by being addressed before he'd addressed her. The matter of your current arrangement. There are questions about the legality of the original agreement, and my clients believe that you may have been coerced, shall we say, into a situation without adequate— That's interesting, Elena said, given that your clients are the ones who made the arrangement without asking me. Elena. Gerald's voice carried the tone she'd heard 1,000 times, the one that meant, stop making this difficult. We're here because we're concerned. You're living here under circumstances that aren't— It's not appropriate, is all. Warren can explain the legal side of it, but the bottom line is we think you should come home. She looked at him for a long moment, looked at Patrice, who was examining the middle distance, looked at Delia, who was looking at the snow. Who's paying for Warren? Elena asked. Holt opened his mouth. Gerald spoke over him. That's not— Who is Gerald? A pause. A family friend has taken an interest in the situation. What family friend? His name is Barrett. He's a businessman out of— Let me guess, Elena said. He made a different offer for me, before Rowan did, and you turned him down because Rowan's offer was better, and now Barrett's funding a legal challenge to get what he originally wanted through the back door. The silence on the porch was very specific. Rowan, who had not said a word yet, turned to look at her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Something close to surprise, and underneath it, something that looked uncomfortably like relief, like he'd been waiting to see whether she'd put it together on her own, and she had. Gerald recovered. That's a very dramatic interpretation. Tell me I'm wrong. He didn't. Holt tried again. The legal question is whether the original agreement constitutes a valid— Can I see your documentation? Rowan asked. Holt looked at him. Of course. If we could step inside. Here is fine. Holt opened his briefcase and produced a folder, which he handed to Rowan. Rowan took it, opened it, and read it with the same unhurried attention he gave everything. Elena watched his face while he read. He didn't react, which meant either the content was what he expected, or he was very good at not reacting, and she'd known him long enough now to suspect it was the first one. He closed the folder. 2 things, he said. First, the original agreement between myself and Gerald Vickers was a debt settlement, not a custody arrangement. Elena isn't named in it. She made her own decision to come here. He glanced at Elena briefly. You're welcome to ask her. She was under duress, Holt began. Second, Rowan reached into his coat and produced his own envelope, which he held out to Holt. I had my own attorney prepare that about 3 days after Elena arrived. Given who Gerald is and the kind of arrangements he's been making, I expected this conversation eventually. I just expected it sooner. Holt took the envelope with the expression of a man recalibrating. He opened it and read. Something in his posture changed. Not dramatically, but enough. "This is a full accounting," he said. "Of the debt settlement, yes. Notarized, filed with the county, and copied to the sheriff's department." Rowan kept his voice level. "It also includes documentation of 3 separate occasions over the past 4 years where Gerald Vickers entered into debt arrangements involving members of his household. Elena isn't the first. If your client wants to open a legal conversation about the validity of these arrangements, I'm comfortable having that conversation." Gerald's face had gone through several colors and arrived at something that wasn't quite any of them. "You had no right," he started. "I had every right," Rowan said. "I also had the time to do it properly, which you didn't account for." He wasn't loud, wasn't aggressive, just very clear, the way solid things are clear. "Elena is not your property, Gerald. She never was. Whatever you told yourself about 16 years of food and shelter, she worked for every bit of it and then some. And the ledger does not balance in your favor." Patrice made a sound, not quite a word, just an exhale of something that might have been shame if she'd been a slightly different person. Delia said, quietly and to nobody in particular, "I told them not to come." Holt was still reading. He turned to Gerald with the expression of an attorney who'd just realized his client had not given him the full picture. "Gerald, some of these records are accurate," Elena said. "All of them." She said it calmly. She'd spent the last 12 days and the better part of 28 years getting to the point where she could say that sentence in that tone, and it cost her something to say it, but less than she'd expected. Gerald looked at her. The paternal face was gone. What was underneath it was smaller and less interesting. Just a man who'd run a calculation and discovered his numbers were wrong. "You don't have anywhere else to go," he said. He said it like it was still true, like it still mattered. "Yes, I do," Elena said. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't triumphant. It was just a fact, stated plainly by a woman who'd recently learned the difference between those two things. Holt closed his briefcase. He said something quiet to Gerald that Elena didn't catch, and Gerald's jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked like he was going to push further. He didn't. He'd done the calculation again and gotten the same answer. They left the way they came. Gerald and Patrice in the rented car without looking back. Holt following. Delia was the last one to the car, and she stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at Elena. "Barrett," she said. "He wasn't a good option. I figured. Dad doesn't... He didn't think it through. He never does." She said it without defense, just accurately. "Are you okay?" "Yeah." "Good." Delia looked at Rowan briefly. Not hostile, not warm, just assessing, then back at Elena. "I'm not coming back after this." Elena considered that. "Okay. I mean, to cause trouble. I'm not." She pulled her coat tighter. "For what it's worth, you always deserve better than what we gave you." Elena held that sentence for a second. It was the closest Delia had ever come to an apology that didn't have an escape route built in. "I know," she said. "Thank you for saying it." Delia nodded once and got in the car. They watched the cars go down the drive and disappear around the tree line, and then the sound of the engines faded into the mountain quiet, and it was just the two of them, and the snow, and the particular stillness of a thing that had been building for a while and had finally resolved. Sheriff Dale Pruitt arrived at Blackstone Ridge 2 hours later, not because anyone had called him, but because, as he explained it, he'd had the Vickers documentation on his desk for a week, and the timing seemed right to have a conversation. Pruitt was a big man going gray, with the careful manners of someone who'd been doing his job long enough to know the difference between a situation that needed authority and one that needed patience. He came inside and sat at the kitchen table and accepted coffee and looked at the documentation Rowan had prepared. And he asked Elena directly, twice, whether she was in this situation by choice. "Yes," she said both times. "Nobody's pressuring you. Nobody's told you what to say." "No." Pruitt looked at Rowan over his mug. "You've been busy," he said. Seemed like the right kind of busy. "Gerald Vickers is not going to be happy." "Gerald Vickers was not happy before I came along," Rowan said. "That's his situation to manage." Pruitt set his mug down and folded his hands on the table. The arrangement he made, trading a person's future for debt clearance, it's not clean legally. It's not clean at all, if I'm honest. I've been looking at his other arrangements, too. He looked at Elena. Would you be willing to make a statement? Not about Mercer, about the Vickers family, the pattern of it. Elena had expected to feel afraid when this question came. She didn't, quite. She felt tired, in the way you feel tired when you've been carrying something for a long time and someone is offering to help you set it down. Yes, she said. Pruitt stayed for another hour. He was thorough, and he was careful, and he didn't editorialize, which Elena appreciated. When he finally stood to go, he shook Rowan's hand and nodded to Elena and said at the door, "The documentation you put together, the accounting, the history, it's solid work." "I had time to do it right," Rowan said. "You had more than time," Pruitt said. He glanced between them. "You had motivation." He left. The house was quiet in a different way after that. Not the quiet of a storm between events, the quiet of something finished. Elena sat at the kitchen table for a long time after Pruitt's truck disappeared down the drive. Rowan sat across from her, not pushing, not filling the space. The thing she'd come to rely on more than she'd admitted was the way he trusted silence to do its own work. "Barrett," she said finally. "Who is he?" "Real estate developer out of Billings. He'd been circling the Vickers property for 2 years. Gerald owed him money, different debt, different arrangement." He paused. "Barrett has a pattern, too, with women who don't have a lot of options." She looked at the table. "That's what you meant when you said the alternative was worse." "Yes. And you found out about it when?" "About 6 weeks before I went to Gerald." His voice was even, but she'd learned to hear what was under it. "I heard something from someone in town, and I looked into it because—" He stopped. "Because you'd been paying attention," she finished. Yes, she thought about that, about the specific weight of it. A man who had noticed her quietly, from a distance, for 8 years, and then spent 6 weeks building a case so that when the moment came, he was ready. Not because she'd asked him to, not because he'd told her he was going to, just because he'd decided she was worth the effort before he'd ever spoken a word to her. "That's a lot," she said. "I know. It's not—" She searched for the right word. "It's not scary, the way I thought it would be when I first started figuring it out. It's just a lot." "Yeah." She looked at him directly. "Why not just tell me? From the beginning? Why all the not yet and the waiting?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because if I'd walked in that first day and said, 'I've been watching out for you for 8 years, and I know how you take your coffee, and there's a notebook,' you'd have run, and you'd have been right to." She opened her mouth, closed it. "I needed you to see the place first," he said, "to see that it was real, that I wasn't, that the intention wasn't to own you or to make you owe me something. The only way that makes sense is if you see it, not if I tell you." Elena sat with that. He was not wrong. She knew, with the clear-eyed certainty of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading situations for survival, that he was not wrong. If he'd told her on that first October morning what she now knew, she would have found a way out. She would have assumed the worst. She'd been built by 16 years with the Vickers to assume the worst. "I hate that you're right about that," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close. "Yeah." She stood up and went to the window. The snow outside was brilliant in the afternoon light, unmarked now except for the tracks from Pruitt's truck. The mountains were clear today, the way they got after a big storm. Every edge sharp, every line definite. "Gerald said I don't have anywhere else to go," she said. "I know. He's not entirely wrong, in a practical sense. I don't have money saved. I've never had a place that was mine." Rowan didn't say anything. "But that's not the same as not having options," she said. "I want to be clear that I understand the difference." "I know you do." She turned around. He was watching her with that careful, steady attention she'd stopped finding unsettling somewhere around the second week, and she looked back at him and let herself do it without looking away. "I'm not staying because I have to," she said, "or because I'm grateful, or because you spent $42,000. Okay. I'm not sure yet exactly why I'm staying, but it's not those things." "Okay," he said again. And the word was different this time. Not a response to information, but something that had more room in it, like a door left open in the right direction. She crossed back to the table and sat down and picked up her coffee cup, which had gone cold. "The documentation you gave Pruitt," she said. "The other women, the other arrangements Gerald made. They'll be contacted, their situations looked at. Good. It took longer than it should have. That's on me, partly. I should have—" "You did what you could do when you knew," she said. "Don't take on more than your share." He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted the way it had that night in the barn, opening slightly in a way he didn't seem entirely comfortable with, but was choosing anyway. "You do that for everyone else," he said. "You never do it for yourself." She considered denying it. Didn't. "Working on it," she said. Outside, one of the horses in the paddock called out. "The bay mare." Elena recognized her voice by now. And from inside the barn, another horse answered. The ordinary conversation of animals in an ordinary afternoon, and Elena sat at a kitchen table in a house that was beginning, slowly, with all the awkwardness and uncertainty that real things require to feel like hers, not because someone had given it to her, not because she'd had no other choice, because she was choosing it, one small decision at a time, with her eyes open. That was different from anything she'd had before. Different in a way she didn't have clean language for yet, but she was working on that too. The sun moved across the floor in the slow way it did in winter, and neither of them rushed it. Spring came to Harlow County the way it always did, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by a hard frost, mud and then snow and then mud again. The mountains held their white longer than the valley, and some mornings Elena would stand at the east-facing window of her room and watch the light come up over the peaks and think about how the same landscape that had tried to kill them in November looked, in April, like it had never intended anything but this. She'd stopped calling it her room sometime in February. She wasn't sure exactly when. It had happened the way most real changes happened, not with a decision, but with a gradual accumulation of small facts. Her books on the shelf instead of stacked against the wall, her quilt on the bed instead of folded at the foot, the chipped coffee mug she'd brought from the vicar's house sitting on the kitchen counter next to Rowan's, because somewhere along the way it had migrated there and neither of them had moved it back. The legal situation with Gerald Vickers resolved in March, not with drama, but with paperwork, which was how most things that actually mattered seemed to resolve. Sheriff Pruitt had been thorough. The picture that emerged from his investigation was not a pleasant one. Gerald had made 3 similar arrangements over 7 years, all involving women with limited resources, and no one positioned to push back. 2 of those women were contacted. One spoke to the county attorney. The resulting process was slow and imperfect, the way legal processes are, and Elena had no illusions that it would end in anything clean or fully satisfying. But it moved, and movement was more than there had been before. Gerald did not go to jail. What he got was a formal censure, a civil filing that would follow his name in county records, and the particular punishment of a small community knowing what he'd done. In Harlow County, that last one carried its own weight. Patrice left for her sister's place in Billings in early March, and didn't come back, at least not that anyone mentioned to Elena. Barrett, the businessman from Billings, lost interest once Pruitt's investigation made the whole arrangement too visible to be worth pursuing. That was the thing about men like Barrett. They needed the dark to operate. Light didn't have to be dramatic to be effective, it just had to be steady. Rowan told Elena most of this at the kitchen table over the course of several evenings. Not as a presentation, but in pieces. The way information comes when 2 people are talking regularly about things that matter. She asked questions. He answered them. Sometimes the answers were incomplete because that's what he had, and he said so rather than filling the gaps with something that sounded better. She appreciated that more than she'd ever said out loud. What was harder to talk about was the thing between them that had been building since November and had no clean name yet. It wasn't that they avoided it. They didn't, exactly. It was more that they were both people who had spent a long time being careful with the things they needed most, and careful takes time to unlearn even when you've decided you want to. He touched her hand once, in February, reaching past her for something on the kitchen counter. He pulled back immediately, the automatic retreat of someone who'd been monitoring his own proximity for months, and she caught his wrist before he could go far and held it for a moment and then let go, and neither of them said anything about it, but something shifted that afternoon that didn't shift back. In March, she started drawing again. It began with a scrap of paper and a pencil she found in the kitchen junk drawer, and she'd drawn the bay mare from memory while Rowan was out doing fence work, just to see if she still could. She could, more or less. The proportions were slightly off, and the hooves were wrong, but the horse's eye was right. That particular wary intelligence the mare had, the look of an animal that had decided to trust someone but reserved the right to revise that decision. She left the drawing on the table. When Rowan came in for dinner, he stopped when he saw it. He picked it up carefully, the way you pick up something you don't want to damage. He looked at it for a long moment. "That's Sienna," he said. "The mare's name." "Yeah." "You said the proportions were off." She blinked. "I didn't say that out loud." "Your face said it." She looked at him. He was still looking at the drawing. "Is it bad?" she asked, and hated that she'd asked it. The old reflex of needing evaluation from someone else. "No," he said. He set it down carefully in the center of the table. "It's really good." She bought a sketchbook the next time they went into town together. She hadn't intended to make it a thing. She was getting flour, and he was getting a part for the water pump, and they'd gone in his truck together, which was also something that had happened gradually and without announcement. The sketchbook was in the window of the hardware store's small general section, and she looked at it for a moment and then put it in the basket. Rowan didn't comment on it. He paid for the pump part. She paid for the flour and the sketchbook. They drove home through the early spring mud, and he told her about the pump, and she told him about a conversation she'd overheard at the feed store about the Caldwell property going up for sale, and it was entirely ordinary and entirely unlike anything she'd had before. The sketchbook filled up by April. She started another one. It was a Wednesday afternoon, overcast and cold, the way April in Montana tends to be, despite all evidence that it should be warming up, when Rowan came into the barn while she was working and stood at the entrance to Sienna's stall without speaking. She knew by now what his different silences meant. This one was the kind that had something in it. "What?" she said. "I want to ask you something." She kept brushing Sienna's flank, not stopping, because she'd learned that she handled serious conversations better when her hands were occupied. "Okay." She heard him breathe, which was unusual. He didn't audibly breathe when he was nervous because he rarely showed nervous, and the fact that she could hear it now meant whatever this was, it had broken through his careful surface. "I don't want you to stay because it's easier than leaving," he said. "I want you to know that first. If you left, I would help you. Money, references, whatever you needed. That's not a condition. It's just true." She turned around. He was standing at the stall door with his hands in his coat pockets and his jaw set and his eyes entirely serious. "I know that," she said. "Okay." He paused. "I'm saying it because what I'm about to ask isn't supposed to be about obligation or gratitude or any of the things this situation started as." "Rowan." "Yeah. Just ask me." He held her gaze. "I'd like to know if you'd want to build something here. With me. Not because I paid a debt, or because you needed somewhere to be. Because you want to." He stopped. "I'm not good at speeches. I don't have a better version of that." Elena looked at him for a moment. At the man who had watched her quietly for 8 years, not as a predator watches, but as someone watches a thing they respect from a distance they've decided is appropriate. Who had spent 6 weeks preparing legal documentation to protect her from a situation she hadn't even known was coming. Who had let her find her own way into his life instead of pulling her into it. Who was standing in a horse barn in April asking her a question with his hands in his pockets because he was nervous and not pretending otherwise. "You're not good at speeches," she agreed. "No." That was terrible, actually. Something moved across his face. Relief and embarrassment and something warmer underneath. "Yeah. Ask me again," she said. "Simpler." He looked at her. "Stay." Elena turned back to Sienna and gave the mare one more stroke with the brush and hung it on the hook and turned around fully. "Yeah," she said. "Okay." It wasn't romantic in the way people mean when they say romantic. There was no music, and the barn smelled like horses, and outside it was trying to sleet. But he crossed the short distance between them, and she let him, and when he put his arms around her, it was the kind of hold that didn't perform anything, just solid and careful and real, the way everything about him tended to be when she wasn't looking for it. She stood there and thought, with the clear and slightly stunned certainty of someone who'd spent a long time not having this. "I picked this." Nobody handed it to me, and nobody took something else away to make it happen. I picked it. That was the part that mattered most. Not the arms, not the barn, not even the man, though he mattered more than she'd admitted to herself until right now. The choice. The fact of it being hers. She'd never had that before. They got married in September, which was neither of their ideas originally, and both of their ideas eventually. Elena had not spent any portion of her life planning a wedding, which turned out to be an advantage because she had no preconceptions to disappoint. Rowan had even fewer, which was consistent with his general relationship to ceremony. What they ended up with was small and honest and slightly impractical in the way real things are. The frontier church at the edge of Harlow was old and drafty, and the floor creaked, and half the congregation were people Elena had known for years without ever being close to, and the other half were people who knew Rowan in the limited way the community knew him, by reputation more than conversation. Caldwell came. He'd come back from Billings in spring after his daughter's recovery, and he and Rowan had rebuilt the north fence line together over 3 weekends, and the relationship between them had solidified into the kind of neighborly bond that frontier communities run on. Not intimate, but reliable, which is its own form of warmth. Pruitt came in his off-duty jacket and shook Rowan's hand and nodded at Elena with the expression of a man who considered this a satisfactory outcome to a situation he'd monitored for several months. Delia came alone. She sat in the back of the church, and she didn't make eye contact with Elena before the ceremony. But when Elena walked past her on the way out, Delia reached out and briefly touched her arm. Elena stopped. "You look like yourself," Delia said. It was a strange thing to say, but Elena understood it immediately. "Yeah," she said. "I think I finally do." Delia nodded. She left after that, before the small reception at the Blackstone Ridge property, and Elena watched her go and felt the particular mixture of things that complicated relationships leave behind. Not resolution exactly, because Delia was who she was, and that wasn't going to change, but something that had less sharp edges than it used to. The reception was at the ranch because it was their place, and they hadn't wanted to be anywhere else. Someone brought a dish Elena hadn't asked for, and someone else brought 2 bottles of wine, and Caldwell's daughter, still moving carefully after her surgery, sat on the porch with a quilt Elena had made and said it was the best quilt she'd ever felt, which was not objectively true but was kindly meant. At some point in the evening, when the sun was going down behind the mountains and the air had that particular September quality, warm and cold at the same time, summer remembering itself while fall made plans, Elena found herself standing at the edge of the yard with a glass of wine and the strange, grounded feeling of a person who is exactly where they're supposed to be. Rowan came and stood beside her. Not behind her. Beside. "How are you doing?" he asked. "Weird," she said. "Good weird." "Yeah. I keep waiting for the other shoe." He looked at the mountains. "Does it feel like there is one?" She considered that honestly. "No," she said. "That's what's weird." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been meaning to tell you something." "Okay." "The notebook." He paused. "I stopped keeping it, the entries, back in November." She turned to look at him. "The night of the storm," he said. "When you pulled me back from the ravine, I had this thought afterward that I didn't need to write things down anymore, because you were here. I wasn't watching from a distance anymore." He said it simply, without drama. Seemed like the right time to stop. Elena looked at the tree line where the last light was going amber and gold and thought about a woman at a county fair 8 years ago who had given her last $5 to a frightened child for a carousel ride. Not because it was significant, not because anyone was watching, but because the child needed something and she had it, and that was the whole of the math. She thought about how that one afternoon, that one unobserved act of ordinary decency, had threaded its way through 8 years and a mountain winter and one man's careful, patient attention and landed here, in this yard, in this life. Not like a fairy tale, not like a reward for good behavior, more like evidence that the things you do when no one is watching are still real, that the person you are in the small moments is still a person, fully, even when no one is cataloging it. And occasionally, rarely, the universe demonstrates this in a way you can actually see. "I used to think," Elena said, "that nobody was paying attention to the small stuff, the daily stuff, whether you helped someone or walked past them, whether you stayed or left." She looked at her wine. I thought it just went into nothing. I know. You proved that wrong. She glanced at him, which is irritating, by the way. How so? Because now I have to believe it all mattered, all of it, which means I also have to believe all the times I didn't help or walked past or that's not how it works, he said. How does it work then? He thought about it for a moment, which she appreciated because he didn't just say the easy thing. You're not the sum of your worst moments, he said, or your best ones either. You're the direction you're pointed. He paused. The kid at the carousel. You didn't do that because you knew I was watching. You did it because that's the direction you were pointed. Elena let that sit. It was true. She had no alternative version of that afternoon where she'd walked past that little girl. It simply wasn't in her, not the person she'd been at 20 and not the person she was now. Not because she was extraordinary. She'd met extraordinary people and she knew she wasn't one. She was ordinary in most of the ways that word meant, with a temper that came out wrong sometimes and a tendency to go quiet when she should speak. And 16 years of defended edges she was still, slowly, learning to soften. But the direction. That part had always been true. What Rowan had done was notice it. What he had done, over 8 years and $42,000 and one terrible blizzard, was treat that direction like it meant something. That was what she'd never had before. Not love exactly, though that was part of it. Being treated like your direction mattered. Like the choices you made when nobody was watching were the real ones, and the real ones were worth something. Sienna had a foal, she said abruptly. He turned to look at her. When? Yesterday morning, while you were at Caldwell's. I was going to tell you. She shook her head. I got distracted by the wedding. Is she okay? She's perfect. He's perfect. She paused. I sat with her for 2 hours. She didn't want anyone else there, but she let me. Elena looked at her hands. She trusts me now, fully. I didn't think she ever would. Rowan was quiet for a moment. What are you going to name him? She thought about it. Something that fits, she said. I'll know it when I see him in the morning light. She named him October because that was when everything had started, and because it seemed right to name something living after a month that had changed the direction of her life. He was a dark bay like his mother, with a crooked white star that didn't match Sienna's clean one. A little off, a little his own, already showing signs of the same wary intelligence his mother carried. In the weeks after the wedding, Blackstone Ridge settled into its autumn rhythms, and Elena settled into them too. She kept drawing. The horses mostly, but also the mountains and the particular quality of October light on the north pasture, and sometimes, from memory, the faces of people she'd known. She had the idea, gradually firming into a plan, of approaching the county fair board about doing illustrations for their program. Small work. Local. Probably unpaid to start. Rowan said go ahead without hesitation. She'd expected discussion and gotten complete confidence, which was still occasionally disorienting. What if they say no? She'd asked. Then you'll know, he'd said, and you'll ask someone else. She'd looked at him. That's it? That's your advice? You stopped because Patrice said it was a waste of time, he said. You've been treating that like information ever since. It wasn't information, it was Patrice. She thought about that for several days. Then she wrote the letter to the fair board. They said yes. It wasn't a large yes. It wasn't a career-changing yes. It was a small-town fair yes, meaning modest and practical and accompanied by the understanding that the program had a limited budget and she shouldn't expect much. She didn't expect much. She expected the work, which was what she'd always been good at expecting. November came back around, and with it, the first anniversary of the day, she'd arrived at Blackstone Ridge with 1 bag and 4 books, and a level of distrust that had been entirely reasonable given the circumstances. She didn't mark the date out loud. Rowan didn't bring it up either, but she was aware of it, the way you're aware of the anniversaries of things that changed you, a background hum of recognition that didn't need to be performed to be real. She was in the kitchen making coffee when she heard him come in from the morning work, and she heard him stop in the mudroom, and then he came to the kitchen doorway and stood there. What? She said. Nothing. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd first seen in the doorway of this kitchen a year ago. The one she hadn't been able to read then. The one she understood now. It was just him, fully, without the performance of restraint. Just a man looking at a woman he'd been paying attention to for 9 years and counting, in a kitchen that was now both of theirs, on a morning that was ordinary in all the ways that mattered. Coffee smells good. It's the same coffee as every morning. I know. She poured him a cup and he sat at the table and she sat across from him. And outside the window, the first winter light was coming over the mountains. And October was in the barn with his mother. And somewhere in Harlow County, things were imperfect and ongoing and unresolved in the way real things always are. But here, at this table, in the particular quiet of a morning that didn't need anything from either of them beyond being present in it, Elena Ashcroft, she'd kept her name, a decision she'd made without discussion, and Rowan had not questioned, sat with her coffee and her ordinary hard-earned life and felt the particular weight of it. Not the heaviness of burden, the weight of something solid, something that didn't shift when you pressed on it. She'd spent 28 years waiting for someone to hand her a life that was hers. What she'd learned, slowly, the way people actually learn things, through evidence rather than revelation, was that it didn't work that way. You didn't wait for it. You didn't earn it by being good enough. You built it, badly at first, out of the materials available, and you kept adjusting, and you let the people who were pointing in the same direction walk alongside you. Not behind you. Not ahead of you. Alongside. She drank her coffee. The light moved across the floor. The horses moved in the barn. And the life she had chosen, imperfect and real and entirely her own, continued on into the morning without asking her permission, which was exactly what she'd always wanted.